So this is super interesting because some of the classic running staples or running breakfasts that people might have, which actually, if you look at the guidance of race nutrition or like the carb loading period, might actually be kind of perfect. But for certain people, they actually might be the cause of the problems.
And they're not like those foods. It's not super high fiber if you're having even white bread with banana and honey, right? So most people might be thinking, okay, high carbs, low fiber, got it. But those foods could still be causing problems for them.
So what can runners do about this? Holly Soto is a registered dietitian who specializes in gut health and has a personal interest in stomach upset in runners. After experiencing gut problems herself with running, she wanted to understand more about it, why it happened, and how she could stop it from occurring in the future. In this video, she talks through the challenges that runners face and explains why, even though someone might not have a medical diagnosis or struggle with stomach problems in their daily life, it can be a huge problem for them when they run. She goes through her top tips to stop this from happening, so that you can improve and enjoy your running and do it without suffering from stomach upset. Holly, great to have you here. Thanks for coming on and chatting with me.
Yes, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So Holly, we've chatted a bit off air and you have a lot of experience in terms of nutrition, running, triathlon. And one of the things I wanted to talk to you today about is running and the symptoms that you can get when running, and chiefly the unpleasant kind. So I know you have a lot of experience about this, and I just wanted to dig into it and really give some good practical advice for the people who are listening here. So for those who don't know who you are, if you could just tell me a little bit about who you are and what you do, that would be amazing.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Holly. I own a company called Renewal Fitness and Nutrition Coaching. So I primarily do nutrition coaching for quite a variety of people and situations, but largely I focus on gut health, on women's health, on weight loss.
By the sounds of it, a lot of runners get these problems where sometimes they can be absolutely fine. They run, everything feels great. And other times they're much more prone to get tummy problems like bloating, diarrhea, cramps, all of those nasty kind of symptoms. Now, there's some advice that you can find out on the internet for how you might be able to stop these. But in truth, it can be quite hard to kind of wade through it all. And I know you have interest and experience in this side of things. So what I'd like to know is kind of how did you get into this in the first place? And what was your motivation for looking into running symptoms?
Yeah, so I have quite a history of just gut health issues, digestive problems. So that's a big passion of mine. That's something I love to help people with. And in my studies, especially when I was going through my master's program, was doing a lot of research into things like celiac and IBS and SIBO and, a lot of these GI disorders. Gastrointestinal disorders is what GI stands for, in case people don't know. And so in the process of doing a lot of research, I found some information that endurance exercise, primarily running, can negatively impact the GI tract. So that sort of led me down this really interesting path of trying to figure out, okay, is my, triathlon, my running, all those things that I'm doing, is that part of the cause of maybe some of my GI symptoms, or what's the relationship there? And that sort of spurred on the idea to have that be my, my thesis, my project that I did to kind of figure out nutrition for runners that would help to reduce GI symptoms. I have GI symptoms or have had more so in the past quite a bit just in daily life, but then also during running and triathlon. So a lot of the races I've done, I've either had, things just like that bloating and discomfort where you feel like you could probably vomit, or I've had abdominal cramps where I've had to actually stop in the middle of a race because my stomach hurts so bad from my cramp and having to deal with that. And I'm sure everyone who runs or does triathlon knows that's super frustrating. You don't want to have to deal with that when, you're trying to go your fastest, do your best. And when you're held back by a GI issue, that's really frustrating. So that was kind of just my own personal experience, really was what drew me into this topic of trying to figure out what can we do about nutrition to help prevent some of these GI symptoms that runners have.
Okay, amazing. And to give us a bit of context, what happens normally when we run? So, because one of the things you suggest, I suggest, is that when we run, especially during races, we need to consume carbohydrates. So what's the normal mechanism that happens when we run and when we consume nutrition?
Yeah, so typically when we run, it's a little bit harder on the body than things even like swimming or cycling. A lot of that just jostling up and down motion is hard on the body. As you are running or doing a lot of different types of exercise, the blood flow that would normally be going through your GI tract and helping to digest and absorb food, all of that blood flow gets redirected to your muscles that are working. So primarily your legs and your heart and your lungs and everything, the blood is being redirected out of the GI tract and into other places. At the same time, there's also sort of this nervous system stress response that happens. The body kind of goes into a little bit of that like fight or flight mode when we're running, and that affects the nervous system within the GI tract. So when you combine all of this, essentially what happens is it can lead to things like inflammation, reduced ability to absorb food, to digest food, because the blood isn't there to help do a lot of that. So digestion slows down. It's difficult to absorb things, and then GI upset can occur when you are, we're typically taking in, like you said, a lot of carbohydrates. So if you're consuming all these foods and liquids, you're just not able to process them in the same way when you're running, especially in something like a race where you're going a little bit faster.
Okay, and I get from what you're saying as well, in that there are some individuals who are more at risk of having tummy problems, because I think probably you might have had the same, that sometimes you're fine or you don't get any problems during a race, and other times it's really bad. Or some people actually will just get problems almost every time they run. So are some individuals more likely to have problems than others?
Yeah, and sometimes there's not a lot of rhyme or reason to it. It could be because of things like IBS or IBD, or celiac disease, like some of these GI disorders. That's going to put you at higher risk because you already have a very sensitive GI tract that doesn't digest well on a normal basis anyway. So those people are probably going to be at a little bit higher risk. Then other people just experience more GI issues, and we might not be able to pinpoint why exactly. Like you said, it may be that they have it sometimes and not other times. And there are different factors too that can contribute. Things like heat, the heat and humidity and everything you're running in can impact that. So for some people, it may be hard to figure out why they're more prone to GI issues. So it's hard to say like who would be more at risk, but we could at least say that the people who already have some sort of gut disorder are probably going to have a little bit higher risk.
Okay. And then just some people are, unfortunately, for one reason or another, are more sensitive than others. So is it the same after 10 minutes versus 60 minutes?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting how this works. So basically, within about 10 minutes of running, somewhere around maybe like 70% of your VO2 max, so a fairly hard effort, already that reduced blood flow is going to start to happen in the gut. So the kind of physiological steps that we just talked about, those could start to occur within 10 minutes. You might not have symptoms within
Okay.
10 minutes, but that process can start pretty quickly into the run. Actual GI symptoms may not start till much later. Typically, people who are doing marathons, ultra marathons, Ironmans, they're going to experience more because typically the longer you go, the harder it is on your GI tract. So it's not as common for people running a 5K or a 10K to experience the same GI upset as someone who does the really long distance. Now, I've had a lot of problems in Olympic distance triathlons and 10Ks, so I've experienced it at short distance, but it's more common that people are going to experience more problems the longer they run.
Okay, and I guess that is part of the reason why typically you find Ironman triathletes or people in the kind of latter stages of a marathon get tummy problems, because there's that almost build-up effect of it starts earlier on in the race and just kind of worsens. Like you mentioned, I suppose are other potential causes for it, but in a sensitive individual, there's that compounding effect over the run.
Right.
Okay. And you kind of answered this question already, but just to make sure, so intensity does matter, in that, as from what I understand, as you exercise more or harder at the intensity, the amount of blood going to your gastrointestinal tract decreases, which means the higher intensity stuff is going to be more likely to cause problems compared to the easier stuff.
Correct, yeah. So most likely if people are out for a recovery run or a zone 2 run, probably won't experience a lot of GI upset unless maybe, they just ate a huge meal right beforehand or something like that we typically try to avoid. But for the most part, a really easy run, it's a lot less likely that someone's going to experience those things. But if you're out for even maybe a short run, but it's, high intensity intervals, sprint work, that type of thing, then you might be more likely to experience it because of that really high intensity. Or like we talked about, the length that you're going.
Okay. And is there any permanent damage from it? So you talked about like inflammation and things being, I guess, irritated from it. So is this a problem?
Yes, that's a great question that I don't fully have an answer to. I wish I did. I've done quite a bit of research, and what I've found, and there could be things out there that I haven't seen yet, but I've talked to different professionals, gut health doctors and things like that, who are also athletes. I've done a lot of research. I've contacted researchers. So what I've found so far is I haven't seen anything very definitive that says, yes, runners who run a lot could probably have permanent damage to their GI tract. At least nothing really conclusive. Unfortunately, there's not a ton of research on athletes. It's just not as financially beneficial typically. It's harder to get money for athletic type studies. So that's part of it, is there's just limited studies looking at people long term and how that affects their GI tract. So that's kind of one of the issues in knowing. But researchers that I have talked to have suggested that yes, it's highly likely that if someone is repetitively doing, marathons, ultra marathons, Ironman, that there could be permanent damage. Doesn't mean it's going to happen to everyone. And it probably is going to have to be something where you are doing it over and over and over and over, not you run for fun or you do a few races a year. You're probably not going to experience something like that unless maybe you already have an existing disorder. So not 100% conclusive, but enough to say that it is possible that someone could experience permanent damage if they're running frequently enough at really long distances.
And I guess the end result either way is that you try and reduce it from happening in the first place, right? Okay. And this in some ways is an obvious question, but how can you tell if you are someone with a sensitive stomach, or a sensitive GI tract? Because we mentioned that the people who might be at higher risk are ones who already have a gut condition. So someone with inflammatory bowel disease or celiac disease. But if you're just the everyday person who, as far as you're aware, you don't have a diagnosis, how could you tell that you're within this group of people who might be more susceptible or sensitive to this?
For the most part, that's kind of an obvious answer, but you're probably going to know if you're part of that sensitive group because you're experiencing these GI symptoms a lot. Now, I think some people don't really, maybe when you hear GI distress or GI upset, you don't even know necessarily what that means, or you don't think that's you. And the symptoms there's a fairly big range of symptoms. So it could be as simple as burping, bloating, like maybe things that probably aren't going to disrupt your race or cause damage or anything like that. So technically that is GI upset, or like runner's stomach, as it's called sometimes. But it could be as disruptive as, diarrhea or a really strong urge to go to the bathroom multiple times when you're running, or like I've had abdominal cramps, stomach pain, that sort of thing. So if you're having a lot of pain, you probably already know that you're in that group. If you don't hardly ever experience any of these symptoms, you're definitely okay. Probably don't have to worry about it. There may also be some people, so like with IBS or irritable bowel syndrome, it's kind of a gut-brain connection thing. So a lot of times that's connected to anxiety or stress or mental health issues. So it could be that maybe people who are under higher amounts of stress and kind of, experience that in the gut might also experience that more when they're running. That's not necessarily based on research. That's sort of just, putting physiological concepts together. So those people could be at higher risk. And like you said, anyone who maybe already has some sort of disorder. Other than that, again, you probably don't know if you're part of that group or if you're at risk to be part of that group. But if you are, you probably already know it because you experience these, upsetting symptoms. And, also some people may think it's just normal. Like people talk a lot about having to go to the bathroom when you run, runner's trots, all those things. But that is, that's these GI symptoms that we don't want to experience. Like you don't necessarily have to experience that all the time. So some people may just think, oh no, I'm fine. It's just kind of normal. But ideally, you don't want to have to deal with these, abnormal things. Maybe you're going to have to go to the bathroom, but if you're constantly feeling like you have this issue with needing to stop and go to the bathroom a lot for diarrhea or needing to vomit or anything like that, then that's definitely something that, puts you in that category.
Yeah, I mean, trying to find somewhere to squat in a field when you're running isn't really the nicest, is it? No, I say, is it like you've had that? I'm not saying you have. I know I've certainly had something similar to it before. To clarify, you mentioned IBS, so irritable bowel syndrome. If you get this sensitive GI issue, it's not that you have IBS, it's just a similar collection of symptoms. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. So there are lots of runners who have IBS. Maybe they know it, maybe they don't know it. But then there are runners who maybe throughout their daily life, they're fine. But when they run, that whole process that I explained, where the reduced blood flow, the nervous system, all those things that, create things like inflammation, permeability, possible GI pain. So that puts the GI tract in a state that's very similar to IBS. So it's this very hypersensitive state where the stomach is not digesting well. Maybe a lot of water is being drawn into the GI tract, gas is being produced. So when we run, it's a very similar type of physiological experience to IBS. So yeah, people might not have IBS, but when they run, it's a similar type of experience that leads to very similar symptoms.
Okay. So what can runners do about this? How do you fix it?
Good question. That's the most important question, right? So there's a variety of factors that play into GI issues, and I explain this all in a course that I have for runners. So there's different things like caffeine, dehydration, heat, all those things can play a part. So it's helpful to maybe keep track of when do you have GI upset, because it could be what you're eating, but it could be other environmental factors, things, what you're drinking or how much caffeine you're taking in, or if you're using NSAIDs, painkillers, basically. So good to know if you're using any of those things, maybe keep track of your symptoms to see what seems to cause it. When do you have it? Do you see any pattern in there? For a lot of people, probably most people, food, the nutrition you use pre and during run, even post run, can play into these GI symptoms. So I know you've talked about on your channel before, just basic things like reducing fiber prior to a race or any big, training weeks or training sessions. In the couple of days leading up, you probably want to keep your fiber low. You're not eating a bunch of broccoli and green vegetables and fruits and things like that, the night before your race or run. But then what I have really dived into more, kind of bringing that whole IBS-like situation that runners have in nutrition, is using what's called a low FODMAP diet for runners. So this is essentially a low fiber diet, but it's a lot more specific. So some runners might have used low fiber before and they're still having GI upset when they run. So what they can do is cut out some of these FODMAP foods, which stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. Very long name, but they're all basically...
Glad you can say that, and I didn't have to.
Yeah, it's a tongue twister. But these are carbohydrates or sugars that we basically don't digest well. We don't really have the enzymes to break them down, so gut bacteria will break them down. And for some people, that's fine. It doesn't cause any problems. For others, it can be very disruptive. So in the state of running, when your body is under a lot of stress, it can be harder to process these foods, even if you do fine with them outside of running. So what I think works well for a lot of people, especially if it's a race we're talking about, is when you go into your carb loading phase, 1, 2, maybe 3 days before, or even the week leading up to, you can start to go on a low FODMAP diet. So you're cutting out some of these foods that are harder to digest because they can remain in the digestive tract for up to about 3 days. So it gives you time to get all of that out of your system so that when you run, hopefully those aren't in there causing any problems. There's a lot of foods. I can't list them all out necessarily, but as an example of, things that runners commonly eat might be things like wheat bread or wheat pasta, banana, like a ripe banana, apples, a lot of vegetables, beans, honey, molasses, fructose, which is in fruit, but it's also in energy gels. So most energy gels have glucose or maltodextrin and then fructose. So for some people, again, they might digest this fine. Typically, if there's more glucose than fructose, it's easier to digest. But if someone's using like honey as their source of fuel, or dates or raisins or dried fruit, kind of wants to go the more natural route, especially in like an ultra distance run, right, where you're actually going to be consuming more real food, all of these high fructose foods can also cause problems. So, someone might typically do wheat bread with banana and honey before a race. That's a pretty common food for runners, but all of those have high amounts of FODMAPs in them, which could contribute to GI issues. So if you in the course that I created for runners, it also has a book. It basically gives a whole list of low FODMAP foods, grocery lists for low FODMAP diet, and kind of how to go about doing this. Because it is a little bit hard to get used to. Most people don't know anything about these. So it kind of spells out, what are these foods? How do you implement this diet? And it's really just a short-term thing. It's not something that runners are supposed to go on long-term. It would just be like the week before a race or a really key training week that you can implement this to see if that helps to reduce your symptoms.
Okay, so this is super interesting because some of the classic running staples or running breakfasts that people might have, which actually, if you look at the guidance of race nutrition or like the carb loading period, might actually be kind of perfect. But for certain people, they actually might be the cause of the problems.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And they're not like those foods. It's not super high fiber if you're having even white bread with banana and honey, right? So most people might be thinking, okay, high carbs, low fiber, got it. But those foods could still be causing problems for them.
Okay, amazing. So, and in terms of kind of strategies to follow to reduce the risk of this happening. So, if we set it out in terms of kind of prep for the race, I guess the first big change here, if you're a susceptible individual, is to start at the beginning of the carb load period. So we're talking somewhere kind of 48, 72 hours, depending on how long you end up doing it for. But it's starting to reduce the fiber and the FODMAP foods at that point.
Right. Yeah. So research has shown that anywhere from like a 1-day low FODMAP to a 7-day low FODMAP has all helped improve symptoms in runners who sometimes have GI symptoms. So you can sort of implement it as you like, but I think it makes the most sense to at least do it during the carb loading period because you're going to be doing a lot of carbohydrates. You want to make sure you're not doing a lot of high FODMAP foods. But you could start, as early as the beginning of the week if you wanted to, just to be extra safe and feel good throughout the week. But at least, I would say about 2 to 3 days right before your race, you would start to cut those foods back.
And then follow the same principle then for your breakfast as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And then during the race too. So I would say it's really helpful for runners to test different gels, different chews, and try some that are only glucose or certain starches. And then also try ones that have the glucose fructose blend and see if they digest both of those well, or if they are sensitive to fructose. That's something you can only kind of test out while you're actually running to see how it affects you when you're in that hypersensitive state. Yeah. So, most people should be testing gels and chews and drinks and all that stuff anyway, but I would suggest that people specifically look at the labels and see what has fructose in there and try them on 2 different days and see what seems to digest better.
See, that is also super cool and interesting, and a place for people to get some potential easy wins for. But it's also so tricky because, again, you look at the research and you look at the advice out there, and I certainly say it on my channel as well, in that dual source carbohydrates are typically the best, and in the right population, they increase the amount of carbohydrates you can absorb and then use for energy. And actually, in those who they do work well with, they reduce the risk or the frequency of gastrointestinal symptoms. But actually, if you're a susceptible individual and you are consuming more fructose, then again, this might be actually the source of your problems.
Right. Yeah. And this is why I think this is also interesting, is because a lot of this is not common information that people know. Like, people know to eat X amount of carbohydrates or combine your glucose and fructose or use natural foods or that types of things. But for some people that just doesn't work. And a lot of times they have no idea why. So I think that's where this information can be really helpful, to realize that there might be certain foods that just don't work well for you. Even if your whole run club uses them and loves them, you might be that one person who's just sensitive to them.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And I guess then you keep some sort of diary, you keep track of everything to make sure that you can kind of test. And I guess you try and keep some things the same and test different options. So, like, maybe keep your breakfast the same, try a different gel. Would that be the way you would approach it?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's always good to keep some sort of journal of, okay, I had symptoms today after I ran. Here's what I ate in the morning or during my run. And like you said, yeah, if you're going to change one thing, probably keep everything else the same. Maybe keep your dinner the night before, the breakfast, all that stuff the same, and then just change the gels. And try to do it at the same intensity too. So don't try, different gels when one day you're running zone 2, the next day you're doing intervals and speed work. Like, try to keep it a consistent pace, or probably best to just try it at race pace. When you're doing like a tempo run or a race pace run, that's the best time to try different things to keep it more consistent, since you will react differently at different speeds.
Okay, makes total sense. And that's one of the things I will always try and say as well. And give it enough time to practice as well before your race. And actually, that's another good question. Would you recommend practicing this before your race? So say your race is on the Sunday, you were thinking you might start doing this low FODMAP diet from the Wednesday. Would you also recommend trying to transition to a low FODMAP diet, say 5 or 6 weeks before, to make sure that you kind of tolerate that okay, that you know what foods to eat? Do you recommend this trial period?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would use it at least once, if not a couple of times beforehand. Probably, like, let's say, for an example, you're doing a marathon or half Ironman. One of those weeks that you're getting to some of your top miles. So you're doing a lot of distance. You're going to be doing maybe some harder runs. That would be a great time to test it out. Do the whole, 3 or so days of cutting back on FODMAPs. This will help you see if it does help you during those runs, but then also familiarize you with the diet and what types of foods you would eat race week and race morning and all of that, and kind of help, figure out what foods you like from the list of foods that shouldn't cause any problems. If you find that it doesn't help you at all during that week, maybe it would still help you during a race, because again, nerves are higher on race day, intensity is usually higher. But if you try it a few times, even during a race week, and you don't notice any difference, then maybe it's not benefiting you. Maybe it's something else you need to deal with. And in that case, great, because then you can go back to your normal eating. No big deal. You don't have to worry about this slightly more complicated carb load. And, we don't want people to restrict foods and go on any special diets if they don't have to. But yeah, it's a great way to test it a few times to see if it seems to help and what foods do work well for you.
And you said earlier, I think, that this isn't a long-term diet. So to clarify, once you're past your race, although things might be a little bit susceptible for hours to a day or two afterwards, you then can go back to your normal diet.
Yeah, exactly. So it's pretty much a race week type of diet. So as soon as you're done with it, and some people are still going to, like you said, be sensitive for a few days, maybe even weeks if it was, kind of an ultra distance and they're really sensitive. So you might even want to do low FODMAP for maybe the next few days, or even just that day at least, while you're in that very hypersensitive state. But yeah, as soon as your race week is done, you can go right back to your normal diet.
Awesome. So, Holly, you have a course on this, don't you? Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. So I created a course to explain all of this because it is a little bit complicated. We're just really scratching the surface, but it still probably sounds a little bit confusing to people. So I created an ebook that you can download that takes you chapter by chapter through what causes GI distress, what is a low FODMAP diet, what are FODMAPs. And like I mentioned before, it's got grocery lists, it's got sample meal plans, it's got a race day planner. There's also a section in there that's kind of like basic fueling guidelines. So regardless of whether you have stomach upset or not, you can use that section for how much should you be eating during different types of runs, because that sort of brings to light how many carbohydrates you need to eat. So that'll help you understand that you have to be cautious with all these high FODMAP foods because they're good sources of carbohydrates. And then I created a video course to go along with it to help teach it, because again, there are sections that are a little bit confusing for some people if you're not very familiar with nutrition. So that course kind of walks you through each chapter and explains some of the more difficult points. So it's a course that you can purchase, and you get, the video and the downloadable PDF all together.
I can vouch for it. It's awesome. It's a really good course. Lots of great information. I looked through it and thought there's so much good stuff and things for me to think about as well, because I'm a runner who typically suffers with a sensitive stomach. So there's stuff for me to try and optimize as well. So I will put a link to the course in the description of this video and in the comments section. So do go and check it out, and either tag me or Holly on Instagram or send us an email as well. We'd love to hear from you. And Holly, how else can people find out about you?
Yes, they can find me on my website at renewalfitcoach.com. And then the handle Renewal Fit Coach is what I use for Instagram, YouTube, Facebook. I'm on all of those pretty frequently, so they can connect with me there as well.
Fab. Thank you so much, Holly, and thanks for giving up your time to help us all out with our horrible tummy symptoms.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the time.
Thanks then, Holly. So I hope you found this chat with Holly as helpful as I did. Make sure you do go check out her course and her content, as there's some super helpful information there for you. Now, if you're interested in more running nutrition videos, I've put a couple up on the screen now that I know will be helpful and make your runs better.